The quiet of my suburban morning was shattered at 6 o'clock by the sound of metal tearing into wood. I watched my son and daughter-in-law violently dismantling my fence, convinced they were finally taking what was theirs. They thought I was too afraid to stop them. But when I stepped onto the porch with a lawyer and a deputy behind me, their arrogance instantly turned into terror. They had no idea I had been preparing for this moment for 3 long months. My name is Evelyn Hartman, and at 62 years old, I should be waking up to the smell of brewing coffee and the gentle chirping of sparrows, not the sound of my home being invaded. It was barely 6 o'clock in the morning in Maple Grove, Colorado, and the sun had not yet burned off the thick, grey mist clinging to the streets. The birds were silent, likely terrified into hiding by the violent screech of metal tearing into wood that shattered the suburban quiet. The noise reverberated through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the single-story house my late husband, Frank, and I had spent 30 years paying off. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The adrenaline was instant, a chemical spike that made my hands tremble, but I forced myself to breathe. The hardwood floor was ice-cold against my bare feet as I stood up, grounding me in the reality of the moment. I could feel the vibrations of the assault traveling up through the floorboards, a physical intrusion that mirrored the violation of my life over the past season. I crept down the hallway, avoiding the floorboard that always creaked, and made my way to the kitchen. I did not turn on the lights. Instead, I moved to the window overlooking the backyard and eased the edge of the floral curtain back just an inch. The sight that greeted me turned my stomach, though it no longer surprised me. My son, Jason, and his wife, Lauren, were waging war on my backyard fence. They looked like scavengers in the dim light. Lauren was wielding a handheld power cutter, slicing through the horizontal cedar beams with a manic intensity. Jason stood beside her, gripping a heavy iron crowbar, his knuckles white with strain. They had brought a full toolbox, clearly intending to dismantle every inch of the boundary I had erected to keep them out. Lauren paused to wipe sweat from her forehead, screaming into the damp air. "This fence blocks our land." Her voice was shrill, piercing the morning fog with a tone of utter entitlement. "She has no right to put this up. It is illegal." She sounded as if the soil beneath her boots belonged to her by divine right, oblivious to whose name was actually on the deed. Jason looked worse. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the red of sleeplessness and misplaced rage. He swung the crowbar, smashing it against a sturdy wooden post with a sickening crack that made me wince. "I don't care if she changed the locks," he yelled, spitting the words out as splinters flew. "I don't care about her little renovations. I am taking back what belongs to me." 3 months ago, witnessing this level of hatred from the boy I once nursed through pneumonia would have broken me. I would have been trembling in the corner, crying into my hands, wondering where I went wrong as a mother. But as I watched them tear at the wood, a strange sensation washed over me. It was not fear. It was a cold, clinical detachment. This was the calm that comes after the storm has already destroyed everything you love, leaving only the bedrock of survival. I had spent 90 days preparing for this exact moment, mourning the loss of my family while they were still living under my roof. I reached into the pocket of my robe and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the camera icon and switched it to video mode. The red recording dot began to pulse, capturing their crime in high definition. With a deep breath that filled my lungs with steel resolve, I unlocked the back door. I did not sneak. I pushed the door open and stepped out onto the patio, my spine straight, my chin high. The screech of Lauren's power cutter died instantly. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise. They spun around, sweat on their brows, ready to bully a 62-year-old widow into submission one last time. But they did not just see me. As they looked past my shoulder, the colour drained from their faces faster than water down a drain. Stepping out from the shadows of my kitchen, flanking me like guardian statues, were two men they desperately did not want to see. On my left was a county deputy sheriff, the morning light glinting off his silver badge. On my right stood Marcus Caldwell, my late husband's trusted friend and a ruthless attorney, holding his leather briefcase with a grim expression. Lauren's hand went limp, dropping from the power switch. The saw dangled uselessly at her side. Jason's grip on the crowbar failed, and the heavy iron tool clattered onto the concrete patio with a dull ring. They stood there, frozen, their mouths slightly open. In that split second, the reality crashed down on them. They were not just having a family dispute anymore. They were staring down the barrel of a criminal record, and the old woman they planned to throw into a nursing home had just sprung a trap 3 months in the making. To understand why I was standing on my back porch with a sheriff and a lawyer, watching my own family try to destroy my property, you have to rewind the tape. You have to go back 3 months, before the anger and the betrayal, to a time when I was just a lonely widow, desperate for the sound of voices in her hallway. I need you to see the woman I was before I became the woman holding the camera. My life before their arrival was quiet, perhaps too quiet. I spent 40 years as a data analyst for Northbridge Analytics, a job that taught me to trust patterns and verify facts. But data does not prepare you for the irrationality of grief. When my husband, Frank, died of a stroke 5 years ago, the logic of my world collapsed. I retired early and retreated into our single-story home here in Maple Grove. This house was not just a building. It was the physical manifestation of our marriage. We had paid off the mortgage check by check, celebrating every $1,000 we chipped away. It was a museum of our shared history. Frank's old acoustic guitar still sat in the corner of the living room, collecting dust but holding the memory of the songs he used to play on Sunday mornings. On the mantelpiece, I kept a tin box filled with birthday cards Jason had made for me when he was a boy, his crayon letters promising he would love me forever. The leather armchairs in the den were worn down at the elbows and faded from the sun. But they were comfortable, and they were ours. My son, Jason, had left this nest years ago for the bright lights of Briarfield. It was a big, bustling city where he met Lauren. My daughter-in-law was a force of nature. She worked as a lifestyle consultant, a profession I never fully understood, but one that seemed to involve telling other people how to arrange their furniture and what colours would bring them spiritual peace. She was sharp, fashionable, and always seemed to know something about the world that I did not. For years, I lived for their visits. They would drive down for a weekend, and I would spend days preparing. I would slow cook the pot roast Jason loved. I would take my grandchildren to the creek at the park, and I would proudly show Jason the new blooms on the rose bushes I tended with obsessive care. Those weekends were the highlight of my calendar, bright spots in a grey existence. Then came that phone call in May. I remember the date perfectly because the weather was unseasonably warm. I answered the phone and heard the roar of city traffic in the background, but it could not mask the tremor in Jason's voice. He sounded heavy, defeated. He told me the startup he was working for had folded overnight. He told me Lauren's consulting contracts had dried up. They were being evicted from their luxury apartment in Briarfield because they could not make the rent. He asked if they could come home. He said it would be temporary, just for a few months until they got back on their feet. A rational person, the data analyst I used to be, might have asked to see a plan. I should have asked about their savings, or why two capable adults had no emergency fund. But I did not think like an analyst. I thought like a mother. I closed my eyes and saw Jason as a toddler, his chest rattling with pneumonia, needing me to hold him upright so he could breathe. That instinct to protect him was hardwired into my DNA. I told him to come immediately. I told him this house was his safety net and that I had plenty of room. They arrived 3 days later. A massive SUV pulled into my driveway, rocking back and forth as it came to a halt. It was packed to the roof with cardboard boxes and suitcases. When Lauren stepped out, she was wearing a designer tracksuit and sunglasses that likely cost more than my monthly utility bill. She looked around my modest front yard and sighed, complaining that the economy was crushing everyone and that it was so unfair. I remember feeling a prick of confusion seeing her expensive clothes while she pleaded poverty. But I pushed it down. I told myself that appearances were deceiving and that they were hurting. That first night was intoxicating. The silence of the last 5 years was broken by the sound of my grandchildren running down the hallway. The dining room was alive with the clatter of silverware and the hum of conversation. I looked around the table at my family, eating the food I had cooked, safe under the roof Frank and I had built. My heart felt full. I felt needed again. I smiled at Jason, and he smiled back, looking relieved to be home. I had no idea that night, as I cleared the plates and listened to their laughter, that I had just opened the door to the people who would try to erase me from my own life. I did not know that this happy dinner was the beginning of a slow, calculated invasion. The invasion of my home did not happen with a bang. It happened in inches, disguised as helpfulness and modern improvement. In the first few weeks, Lauren began what she called the optimization of our living space. It started on a Tuesday morning when I came into the living room to find her standing with her hands on her hips, staring critically at Frank's old leather armchair. It was the chair he had sat in every evening for 20 years, the leather worn soft and cracked in a way that molded perfectly to a human back. Lauren told me it had to go. She said it looked gloomy and did not fit the aesthetic she was trying to cultivate for us. She suggested we move it to the garage to open up the floor plan. I tried to object. I told her that was where Frank used to read his newspapers, but Jason cut me off before I could finish the sentence. He looked up from his phone and told me it was just a chair. He said Lauren had an eye for design and that I should let her make the decisions because the house felt outdated. That was the first time I felt it. A cold prickle of irrelevance. I was being told I was obsolete in the very room where I had raised my family. By the afternoon, the chair was sitting on the concrete floor of the garage, covered in a plastic sheet like a corpse. The next week, the changes became more aggressive. I came home from the grocery store to find my living room transformed. The cream-colored curtains I had sewn myself a decade ago were gone. In their place hung stark, flat panels of grey fabric that Lauren had ordered online. They looked like industrial sheets. When I asked where my curtains were, Lauren waved a hand dismissively and said she had boxed them up to create visual space. She claimed the room needed to breathe. But to me, it felt like the warmth was being sucked out of the walls. Then the smaller erasures began. I would walk down the hallway and notice a gap on the bookshelf where a picture frame used to be. The photo of Frank and me at the Grand Canyon was gone. The antique clock that sat on the entryway table vanished. When I asked about them, Lauren would smile that tight, patronizing smile and say she was just dusting or decluttering. She told me she put them away to keep them safe, but they never reappeared. My history was being packed into boxes and shoved into the dark corners of the attic. Even the smell of the house changed. The aroma of my slow-cooked stews and baked bread was replaced by the sterile scent of raw kale and expensive organic juices. Lauren took over the kitchen, declaring a new dietary regime for the whole family. She replaced my groceries with brands I had never heard of and could barely afford. When I suggested making my traditional meatloaf for Sunday dinner, Lauren sighed as if I had suggested serving poison. She told me that greasy food was terrible for my heart, and that at my age, I needed to be more responsible. It was a subtle insult wrapped in fake concern. In the evenings, the living room was no longer a place for conversation or old movies. Jason and Lauren dominated the television. They watched endless vlogs about lifestyle optimization and minimalism. I sat in the corner and watched young, beautiful people on the screen preach about throwing away anything that did not bring immediate value. It felt like a direct commentary on my existence. I found myself retreating earlier and earlier, confined to the small square footage of my bedroom, a corner of the kitchen, and the single patch of sunlight by the window where my potted plants lived. When I finally gathered the courage to tell Jason that I missed my things, that I missed the way the house used to feel, he gave a short, uncomfortable laugh. He told me I was being too sensitive. He said I needed to learn how to let go because nobody could live in the past forever. His words felt like a slap. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, I felt like a ghost haunting my own hallways. I tried to soothe my panic by telling myself it was only temporary. I told myself they would be back on their feet in a few months, and my life would return to normal. I did not know yet that there would be no normal to go back to. The unraveling of my financial security began on a Tuesday afternoon when I returned from the market earlier than usual. I walked into the dining room to find Lauren arranging my antique porcelain set on the table. It was the blue and white collection Frank had bought for me during a business trip to Savannah 30 years ago. A set I treated with reverence. Lauren was standing over it, snapping photos with her phone. When I asked what she was doing, she did not even flinch. She told me she was listing it on a resale app just to see if anyone was interested. She claimed I never used it anyway, so it was just gathering dust. I looked at her phone screen and saw the listing price. It was insulting. She had listed the entire collection for a few $100s, a fraction of the valuation listed on my insurance policy. When I demanded she take it down, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Lauren did not apologize. Instead, her eyes filled with tears. She started talking about how expensive the children's tutoring was and how Jason was slipping into depression because he could not provide for his family. She twisted the narrative so quickly that within minutes, I was no longer the victim of theft. I was the selfish old woman hoarding dusty plates while her grandchildren suffered. Jason walked in and joined the chorus. He pleaded with me to help them just this once, promising he would pay me back the moment he found a job. Under the weight of their combined guilt, I crumbled. I refused to sell the Savannah set, but I compromised. I allowed them to sell a different, less valuable dinner service. I told myself I was being a good mother, making a sacrifice to keep the peace. A few weeks later, the requests escalated from household items to hard currency. Lauren approached me with bright eyes and a glossy brochure. She told me about a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity. Her friend was opening a high-end yoga and wellness studio in Briarfield, and they were looking for silent partners. She told me that if I contributed $50,000, my money would double within a year. She smiled and asked if I really wanted my savings to sit dead in a bank account, earning pennies in interest when it could be working for the family. I hesitated. $50,000 was a significant portion of what Frank and I had saved for my twilight years. But Jason sat me down and held my hand. He reminded me of how often I said I wanted to leave a legacy for him and the kids. He asked why I would wait until I was dead to help them when I could change their lives right now. They played on my fear of irrelevance and my desperate need to be useful. I wrote the check. However, when Lauren showed me the preliminary paperwork, I noticed a glaring omission. The investment was entirely in her name. My name was nowhere to be found. When I pointed this out, she gently took the papers from my hand and told me she was handling the administration to save me the headache. She said legal paperwork was too complicated and I should not worry my pretty head about it. From that moment on, my bank account began to bleed. It was a slow hemorrhage of expenses labeled as family necessities. There were credit card bills of Lauren's that mysteriously appeared, supposedly for groceries and essentials, though the totals were staggering. There were legal fees for a contract dispute Jason was allegedly fighting, though I never saw a single invoice or court document. There were urgent medical checkups for Jason that required cash payments, yet no results were ever mailed to the house. The climax of this financial assault came 2 months later. Lauren sat at the kitchen table one evening, sobbing uncontrollably. She confessed that she and Jason had been trying for a third child, but were struggling. She told me her doctor said she had a limited window to conceive and needed an emergency fertility procedure. The cost was $80,000. My heart broke for her. The thought of another grandchild was a powerful lure, tapping into my deepest biological instincts. I did not have that kind of cash lying around anymore, not after the investment and the debts. So, I did the unthinkable. I sold a small plot of land in the countryside that Frank had bought years ago, a place we had once hoped to build a vacation cabin on. I handed over the proceeds to save the future of my family line. I truly believed I was buying hope. I did not know I was funding my own destruction. The illusion of my family's bad luck finally shattered on a mundane Wednesday afternoon in the detergent aisle of the local supermarket. I bumped into Mrs. Gable, the owner of a nail salon down the street where Lauren liked to go for her weekly manicures. We exchanged pleasantries, and then Mrs. Gable leaned in with a conspiratorial smile. She told me that Lauren looked absolutely stunning and asked if I was not amazed by the surgeon's work. She said the rhinoplasty was so subtle, yet transformative. I froze, my hand tightening around the handle of my shopping cart. Lauren had never mentioned a nose job. I pressed Mrs. Gable for details, keeping my voice steady, and she happily chirped that Lauren had the full cosmetic package done at an elite clinic in the city exactly 2 months ago. The timeline hit me like a physical blow. 2 months ago was exactly when Lauren had wept at my kitchen table about her fertility issues. The $80,000 I had raised by selling my land had not gone toward a new grandchild. It had gone toward a new face for my daughter-in-law. I drove home in a daze, my stomach churning with nausea. When I got inside, I went straight to the drawer where I kept the few papers they allowed me to see. I pulled out the receipts Lauren had given me for the disbursement of the funds. I had been so trusting that I had barely looked at them before. Now, staring at them with clear eyes, I saw them for what they were. They were generic transfer slips marked simply as medical expenses with no provider names and no hospital logos. I had handed over my late husband's legacy for vanity surgery disguised as a family crisis. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Around 2 a.m, a giggle drifted down the hallway. I got up and crept toward the living room. Lauren was on the phone, her voice low but carrying in the silence of the house. I heard her say that there was nothing better than upgrading herself while the old lady paid the bill. She laughed and said that life was fair when you made it fair. I wanted to believe I had misunderstood. I wanted to believe there was some context I was missing. But 3 nights later, the final veil was lifted. I woke up thirsty and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I reached for a glass, I heard voices drifting in from the back patio. The sliding glass door was cracked open just an inch to let the cigarette smoke out. I stood in the darkness, pressing my back against the refrigerator, and listened. Lauren sounded irritated. She told Jason that my money was drying up and that if they did not act fast, I would lock down my accounts. She said I would start hoarding the house like a miser. Jason answered her, his voice heavy with fatigue. But he did not defend me. He did not tell her to stop. He simply asked what the plan was. Lauren laid it out with chilling precision. She said they needed to take over my financial management completely. They would convince me to sign over power of attorney by claiming it was to protect me from scammers. Then, once the assets were transferred to Jason's name, they would move me. She mentioned a facility called Shady Pines in a neighboring state, noting that it was cheap and accepted Medicaid, which would leave the rest of my assets untouched for them. Then came the sentence that made my blood run cold. Lauren looked out at the backyard, the same yard where I had taught Jason to catch a baseball. She told him that I did not need all that space. She said I would be fine sitting in a chair at the nursing home looking at a tree. She proposed that once I was gone, they could tear down the wooden fence, expand the yard into the back lot, and put in a swimming pool. She said the house value would double with those renovations. I backed away into the shadows, clutching my chest. This was not just a son and daughter-in-law falling on hard times. This was not just selfishness. It was a calculated, predatory extraction. They were not waiting for me to die. They were actively planning to discard me so they could terraform my life into their luxury estate. The fence they wanted to tear down was not just wood. It was the boundary of my existence, and they were ready to bulldoze it along with me. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in the armchair in my bedroom, staring at the shadows moving across the floor, while the voice of my late husband played on a loop in my mind. Frank used to hold my hand when I forgave people too easily and tell me that I was too good for my own good. He warned me that good people become prey if they do not know how to be hard when it matters. For years, I thought he was just being protective. Now, in the silence of a house that no longer felt like mine, I realized he was giving me a survival guide. I got up and opened the small fireproof safe in the back of my closet. My hands were steady as I shuffled through the deed to the house, the insurance policies, and finally, a yellowing business card I had not looked at in 5 years. It belonged to Marcus Caldwell, Frank's old friend and the attorney who had handled our mortgage paperwork decades ago. I slipped the card into my purse, feeling like I was arming myself for battle. The next morning, I told Lauren and Jason that I had a routine health checkup at the clinic. They barely looked up from their phones to acknowledge me. I waited until I was around the corner before I called a car service to take me into downtown Dunford. sitting in the back of that car, watching the familiar streets pass by. I felt a wave of nausea. I was about to go and tell a stranger that the son I raised was plotting to discard me like a piece of broken furniture. Marcus Caldwell looked older than I remembered, his hair completely white, but his eyes were just as sharp. He listened without interrupting as I poured out the story. I told him about the nose job disguised as fertility treatments, the vanished savings, and the conversation about the nursing home and the swimming pool. I had to pause several times to keep my voice from cracking, but I got through it. When I finished, Marcus did not look surprised. He looked sad. He leaned forward and told me clearly that this was not just bad behavior. It was elder financial abuse. He gave me a choice. He said I could go home and let it happen, or I could start building a fortress around what was left. I chose the fortress. Marcus suggested we create an irrevocable trust. He explained that we would move the title of the house and the land into this trust. I would retain the right to live there for the rest of my life, but the ownership would legally bypass Jason entirely. The beneficiaries would be my grandchildren, Chloe and Mason, meaning Jason and Lauren could never sell it, borrow against it, or turn it into a swimming pool. I agreed immediately. However, Marcus warned me that I needed insurance. If they tried to challenge my mental capacity to manage my affairs, which they were already planning to do, I needed proof of their malicious intent. He told me to get everything on tape. I returned to Maple Grove and went straight to the house next door. My neighbor, Martha, a widow as meticulous as a watchmaker, listened to my request with pursed lips. She went into her drawer and pulled out a small USB voice recorder that her grandson had given her for recording lectures she never attended. We sat at her kitchen table, two grey-haired women fumbling with buttons and reading tiny instruction manuals like clumsy spies, until we figured out how to make it work. That afternoon, I became a ghost in my own home. I taped the recorder under the lip of the kitchen island where they stood to drink their morning coffee. I hid another one deep between the cushions of the sofa. I placed a third one inside a hollow decorative owl on the back patio shelf, right near the spot where they smoked their cigarettes. Every evening, when they were occupied with their screens, I would retrieve the devices and listen. It was a form of self-torture, but it was necessary. I heard Lauren call me senile and laugh about how easy it was to manipulate me. I heard Jason agree that the fence was just a pile of wood that stood in the way of their property value. Each insult was a lash that stripped away my sentimental weakness. The mother in me was dying with every playback, but the woman who owned the house was waking up. They thought they were dealing with a confused old lady. They had no idea they were providing the evidence that would seal their own eviction. Once the irrevocable trust was signed and filed with the county clerk, Marcus Caldwell gave me one final instruction that was harder to follow than any legal advice. He told me to go home and act like the victim they wanted me to be. He said that if I wanted to catch them in a truly undeniable act of malice, I had to make them feel safe. I had to make them believe that their victory was inevitable, so they would get sloppy and reveal their true nature. So, I went home and started the performance of a lifetime. I began to sprinkle small errors into my daily routine. I would walk into the kitchen and stand there, looking confused, pretending I had forgotten why I entered the room. I asked Jason what day of the week it was, even though I had the calendar right in front of me. I watched Lauren out of the corner of my eye as I fumbled with the television remote, calling it the clicker and complaining that the buttons were too small. She did not look concerned. She looked delighted. I saw her texting on her phone immediately after, likely documenting my decline to build her case for the nursing home. A few days later, Lauren approached me with a stack of documents. She had her serious, concerned face on. She told me it was a power of attorney form. She said it was just a precaution, in case I fainted or had to go to the hospital, so she could handle the bills for me. I looked at the papers with feigned bewilderment. I told her the legal language made my head spin and that I needed some time to think about it. I did not say no. I just dangled the possibility in front of her like a carrot. That evening at dinner, I set the trap. I let out a long, heavy sigh and rubbed my lower back. I said that the garden was becoming too much for me to manage and that fixing the fence and sweeping the patio was exhausting. Lauren practically jumped across the table. She told me that I was absolutely right. She said the house and the land were a burden I should not have to carry, and that a facility would be so much gentler on my aging body. Jason chimed in right on cue. He suggested that maybe we should handle the paperwork to transfer the house title to his name. He claimed it would keep things simple and avoid legal trouble down the road. He made it sound like he was doing me a favor by taking my biggest asset. I looked at him, widened my eyes, and acted as if a light bulb had gone on in my head. I told him that was a very serious step, and that perhaps we should have a lawyer come over to explain the process to me so I could feel comfortable. They exchanged a look of triumph. They thought I was asking for permission to surrender. They did not know I was inviting the executioner to tea, to seal the deal. I sat down at the kitchen table one night, when I knew Lauren was watching from the hallway, and wrote a letter on my personalized stationery. I wrote that I was tired and that perhaps it was time to find a quiet place to rest for my final years. I left the letter on the counter, knowing Lauren's prying eyes would find it within the hour. While they were busy celebrating their premature victory, I was quietly stripping the house of its soul. I took my wedding album, Frank's watch, and the few pieces of jewelry that had real sentimental value, and I smuggled them over to Martha's house in reusable grocery bags. I told Jason I was donating old clothes to charity. The house was becoming a stage set, filled with props, but empty of the things that could truly hurt me. Finally, I hired a local security company to install 2 wide-angle cameras on the back eaves of the house, pointed directly at the patio and the wooden fence. I told Jason that I had heard reports of petty theft in the neighborhood and was worried about burglars. He rolled his eyes and told me I was being paranoid, but he let the technicians do their work. He did not realize that the lens was not there to catch a stranger. It was there to catch him. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a strange, twisting knot in my chest. It was a physical ache to realize that I had to trick my own son to protect myself. But underneath the grief, there was something else. It was a cold, dark satisfaction. For months, they had treated me like a senile old woman who was losing her grip on reality. They were about to find out that while they were playing checkers, I had already cleared the chessboard. The moment of truth was coming, and for the first time in a long time, I was not afraid of the outcome. I was looking forward to it. Marcus Caldwell moved with the precision of a surgeon as he stitched together the final pieces of my legal defense. Within a week, the irrevocable trust was complete. The document was a masterpiece of protection. It explicitly listed the house and the entire plot of land, including the specific strip of backyard along the fence line that Jason seemed so obsessed with claiming. Marcus had even commissioned a fresh land survey to ensure the boundaries were indisputable in a court of law. The deed was quietly transferred into the trust, meaning that, technically, Evelyn Hartman no longer owned the house. The trust did. And the trust had strict instructions that I was to remain the sole resident until my last breath. But Marcus did not stop at securing the real estate. He helped me compile a dossier that was thick enough to be a weapon. We organized a spreadsheet detailing every single dollar I had transferred to Lauren. We printed copies of the emails regarding the wellness studio that never existed. Most damning of all, Marcus obtained a copy of the invoice from the cosmetic surgery clinic in Briarfield, proving that the money for my non-existent grandchild had actually paid for Lauren's new profile. It was black and white proof of fraud. From the hours of audio I had recorded, Marcus selected 2 specific clips to transcribe and authenticate. The first was Lauren's voice, clear and sharp, saying that once I signed the transfer papers, the land would be theirs and she would tear down the fence the very next day. The second was Jason, my own son, agreeing that I would be fine living out my days in a cheap facility so they could have their swimming pool. Marcus advised me to have a petition for a temporary restraining order drafted and ready to file. He explained that if Jason or Lauren became violent or attempted to destroy property when the truth came out, the police would need immediate legal grounds to remove them. I followed his instructions to the letter regarding my finances. I went to the bank and withdrew enough cash to cover my personal expenses for a month. Then, I transferred the bulk of my remaining savings into a new account that required Marcus's signature for any withdrawal greater than $100. I also called the credit card company and cancelled the supplementary cards Jason had been carrying, to avoid triggering an explosion too early. I continued to pay for the groceries and the electricity bill, keeping up the appearance of the dutiful, providing mother. However, whenever Lauren brought up a new investment opportunity or asked for cash for an unexpected bill, I feigned ignorance. I told her the bank was acting slow or that I needed to review my statements later. The sudden tightening of the purse strings made them desperate. The atmosphere in the house became suffocating. Jason and Lauren ramped up the emotional pressure, constantly talking about how burdening it was to care for me. They would sit at dinner and discuss how I was holding them back from living their own lives, looking at me with undisguised resentment. It took every ounce of my willpower to sit there and eat my peas without screaming. But I knew I had to wait for the trap to spring. 2 days before I planned to drop the hammer, I met with Deputy Sheriff Shay Miller at a coffee shop on the edge of town. I had known Shay since he was a boy playing Little League with Jason. I kept the details brief, but showed him the restraining order draft and the proof of ownership. I asked him for one favor. I told him that on a specific morning, my lawyer would be at the house, and things might get volatile. I asked that if he received a call from me or Marcus, he would make it a priority. He looked at the documents, then at my tired eyes, and nodded. He promised he would be close by. Everything was finally in place. That evening, I walked into the living room where Jason and Lauren were sulking and delivered the performance of my life. I told them I was ready. I told them they were right, that the house was too much work, and that I was ready to sign the title over to Jason so I could move to a managed facility. I suggested that we have the lawyer come over on Monday morning to handle the paperwork. They were ecstatic. They thought they had finally worn me down. They believed the lawyer coming was there to hand them my life's work. They had no idea that the man walking through that door would be Marcus Caldwell, and he would be bringing an eviction notice, not a deed of gift. 3 days before the day of reckoning, I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. We were sitting at the dinner table, the silence thick enough to choke on, when I placed my silverware down on the plate with a deliberate clink. I looked at Jason, then at Lauren, and forced a weary, defeated smile onto my face. I told them that I had been doing a lot of thinking and that perhaps they were right. I admitted that the house was simply too large for me to manage alone anymore. I said that if we transferred the deed to Jason and moved me into a quiet facility for the elderly, it would probably be best for everyone involved. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Lauren looked as if she had just won the lottery. Her eyes actually shimmered with greed. And I saw her hand dart under the table to squeeze Jason's knee in victory. She wasted no time. Before I had even taken another breath, she suggested we call a lawyer friend of hers immediately to draft the transfer papers that very night. She was eager to close the steel trap before I could change my mind. I played my part perfectly. I hesitated, looking frail and uncertain, and suggested that we use Marcus Caldwell instead. I reminded Jason that Mr. Caldwell had handled all the paperwork when his father was alive, and that having a familiar face would make me feel safe during this big transition. Jason saw the logic in it. He assumed that an old family friend would be soft, sentimental, and easy to steamroll. He agreed to set the appointment for 9 o'clock on Monday morning. On the day before the meeting, I made my final physical move. I called a locksmith while they were out running errands and had every cylinder in the house replaced, including the heavy deadbolt on the back gate. When Jason came home and his key refused to turn in the front door, I met him with a flustered apology. I blamed the recent reports of petty theft in the neighborhood and claimed I had panicked and upgraded the security. I told him the locksmith had only been able to cut one set of keys that afternoon, but promised I would have duplicates made for him the next day. He was annoyed, muttering about how necessary it was for him to have access. But he bought the lie because he believed he would own the entire building in 24 hours anyway. That night, the eve of their downfall, I heard the final confirmation of their malice. I was standing in the dark hallway when I heard Lauren whispering to Jason in the bedroom. She told him that the moment the house was in his name, they were going to tear down the back fence. She said they would redraw the property lines to include the easement behind us, so the yard would be big enough for a pool. And she specifically mentioned getting rid of my useless flower beds. In that moment, the wooden fence in my backyard ceased to be just a barrier of cedar planks. It became the symbol of everything I was fighting for. It was the line Frank had drawn, and I was going to hold it. Mr. Caldwell arrived at 7 in the morning on the big day, slipping in through the garden gate I had unlocked for him. We sat in the kitchen with the blinds drawn, reviewing the camera angles and the trust documents one last time. We rehearsed the few key phrases we would need if things got loud. I showed him the fresh batteries in the recorder and the position of the sheriff's deputy, who was parked just down the street. At 9 o'clock sharp, Jason and Lauren appeared at the front door. They were dressed for a business meeting, holding a thin folder that undoubtedly contained the power of attorney paperwork they expected me to sign. I watched on the hallway monitor as Jason slid his key into the lock. It did not turn. He tried again, harder this time, jiggling the handle. When it refused to budge, confusion turned to irritation. Lauren began to knock, a sharp, rhythmic rapping that quickly escalated into pounding. She pulled out her phone and called me, but I watched my screen light up on the kitchen counter and let it ring. The pounding on the door became a violent thudding. They knew I was home. They knew the lawyer was due. The fact that they were locked out of a house they already considered theirs sent them into a blind rage. I heard Lauren shout that I was probably asleep or playing games. Then, I heard the heavy stomp of their footsteps leaving the front porch and moving around the side of the house. They were heading for the backyard, intending to force their way in through the rear sliding doors. But finding the fence locked would be the spark that ignited the explosion. We stood up, Marcus and I, and waited for the sound of metal hitting wood. We are back to the moment the metal hit the wood. The screech of the power cutter slicing through my cedar fence was the sound of their greed finally tearing itself out into the open. Lauren was shouting over the noise, screaming that this was their land and that I had no right to block their view. Jason was hacking at a support post with the crowbar, his face twisted in a mask of entitlement. The camera mounted on the eaves above me blinked its silent red eye, capturing every second of their felony. I stepped out onto the patio, not as the trembling mother they expected, but as the owner of the estate. I raised my voice just enough to cut through the din. I told them that there were 3 things they needed to know immediately. First, I said, you are destroying private property. Second, everything is being recorded. And third, the owner of this property is not Jason Hartman. The noise stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and instant. From behind the patio furniture, Marcus Caldwell stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. He introduced himself with a voice like gravel, informing them that he was my legal counsel. Right behind him, Deputy Shay Miller stepped out from the shadows of the kitchen doorway, his hand resting casually near his belt. He ordered them to put the tools down, stating that he had a prior report regarding a credible threat to the property of an elderly resident. Lauren recovered first, though her voice was shaking. She dropped the saw and started shouting that the fence was illegal. She claimed it was encroaching on their land and that the house was practically Jason's anyway, because he had invested so much sweat equity into fixing it up. Marcus did not argue. He simply opened his briefcase and pulled out the land survey and the trust documents. He held up the map, showing the bright red line of the boundary that placed the fence firmly on my side. Then he produced the bank records, proving that every cent spent on repairs in the last 3 months had come directly from my account, not Jason's. Then Marcus pulled out the transcript. He read the words aloud, his voice flat and unemotional. He read the part where Lauren said that all she needed was for me to sign the paper so they could tear down the fence and build a pool the next day. He read the part where Jason agreed that putting me in a budget nursing home was a fair trade for a bigger backyard. When the words hung in the air, the color drained from Lauren's face until she looked like a sheet of paper. Jason dropped the crowbar. It hit the concrete with a clang that sounded like a bell tolling for his future. He collapsed onto the bottom step of the patio, putting his head in his hands. I looked at them, and for the first time, I did not feel the urge to cry. I felt lighter. I listed their debts to me one by one. I spoke about the antique porcelain sold for pennies. I spoke about the $80,000 I gave for a fertility treatment that was actually a cosmetic surgery bill. I spoke about the fake wellness studio and the plot to ship me off to a facility in another state just to save money. Marcus delivered the final blow. He announced that, as of 3 days ago, the house and the land were the property of an irrevocable trust. I had the right to live there for the rest of my life. The beneficiaries who would inherit it after I was gone were my grandchildren, Chloe and Mason. Jason and Lauren were not named anywhere in the document. They would never own a single square inch of this soil. Deputy Miller stepped forward and gave them a choice. He said they could leave the property immediately and return only to remove their personal belongings within 48 hours under police supervision. Or, he said, he could arrest them right now for vandalism, and we could file immediate charges for elder financial abuse with the district attorney. The unity of their marriage disintegrated in seconds. Jason fell to his knees, sobbing and begging me to understand, pointing a finger at Lauren and claiming it was all her idea. Lauren turned on him instantly, screaming that he was a coward and a liar, saying she only wanted to help the family. They tore at each other with words, exposing the ugliness of their souls right there on my lawn. I did not scream. I did not make a scene. I simply looked at them and told them the truth. I said that they had chosen money and land over their mother and kindness. I told them that today. I was giving them exactly what they chose. No home, no land, just consequences. I turned my back on them and walked into the house, listening to the sound of their footsteps retreating down the driveway. The fence was scarred, but it was still standing, and so was I. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today, so please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and let's chat. Please consider subscribing to Grandma's Family Diary, hitting the like button, and pressing the hype button to help this story get heard by more people.